Hi all, welcome back. In the last part of our treatment of stress today, we're going to be looking at some aspects of the development of stress in English and French. The fact is that the assignment of stress in English is pretty complicated, and attempts to deal with the assignment of stress by rule in English. There is a very famous example of an enormously complicated rule in Chomsky and Halley's stress pattern of English, which reveals that coming up with a unified treatment of stress in English is very difficult. What we're just going to consider today is in part some change in the assignment of stress in English. So in the stress pattern that English inherited from Proto-Germanic, there seems to have essentially been a rule which assigned stress to the first syllable in a word. This is a little more complicated because in verbs which had prefixes, those prefixes were usually unstressed, which meant that a stress in those verbs can be described as sort of root initial. However, prefixed nominal forms did have less left edge stress. So there was a sort of distinction in behavior between verbal and nominal forms when prefixes were added. And you can see Donkominkova's treatment of phonological history of English or Hogg's grammar of Old English for some details on the stress system in Old English. Now, one important thing that occurred in the sort of external history of English is that the language borrowed a lot of Latin words, which had a stress rule that looked more essentially like the rule that we just developed for classical Arabic. Primary stress was assigned to the third to last syllable if the second to last syllable was short. Otherwise, stress fell on the second to last syllable and otherwise on the final syllable in words with only a single syllable. The result is that, of course, most words then of Latin were stressed on the penult or antepenult. There were also a number of words borrowed from Old French into English, which had stress on the final syllable. In Old French, primary stress was generally assigned to the last syllable of the word. Now, in a number of words of English, the result is that would be the stress pattern would be indistinguishable. The stress patterns of Latin would have been indistinguishable from the pattern of English. So for instance, in all three languages, that is in Latin and Old French and Old English, one syllable word, all three languages would have assigned stress to the first syllable. Let's actually compare this. Let's call this the Old English system versus the Latin system versus the Old French system. One syllable word, all three languages would have the same stress pattern, regardless of the syllable weight. And in a two-syllable word, again, regardless of syllable weight, all three of these languages, or definitely Old English and Latin, actually, yes, they're all partly weight sensitive. Old English and Latin, under their stress rules, would have assigned stress to the penultimate syllable, though Old French would have behaved differently. Instead, in a two-syllable word, stress would have been assigned to the last syllable. So this is, I'll place differences with respect to the English system here. Now, in a word with three syllables, if the penult was light, I need to borrow a breath, copy the breath. If the penultimate syllable was light, then in both English and in Latin, the stress pattern would have been the same. Again, in Old French, this would have been different because the final syllable would have received stress. A difference, however, would have arisen in words with three or more between Latinate words and Old English words, in that here Latinate words would have assigned primary stress to the penultimate syllable, whereas Old English would have assigned stress to the initial syllable. So at least in all monosyllabic and all disyllabic and some trisyllabic words, the stress systems of Old English and Latin would generally have assigned primary stress to the same syllable. And because of this other wrinkle in terms of this other problem concerning prefixed forms, perhaps accidentally, some prefixed verbs which would have had this shape could have also assigned stress under the same conditions as Latin did. Now, ultimately, ultimately, a result of these borrowings from Latin and Old French and this significant overlap in the outputs of the Germanic and Latin stress rules is that English now seems to have a general stress rule which basically behaves like the Latin stress rule. And if we take a look at a number of words of English, and I'll give some phonetic transcriptions here in one moment, these seem to follow the rule of stress assignment in English. So the word discipline, this is a trisyllabic word, and we can treat the second syllable as being a light syllable, discipline. I won't be so precise about the transcriptions of the vowels for the moment. In this case, we have primary stress on the third to last syllable, and the second to last syllable can be treated as a light syllable. And crucially, in order for this second to last syllable here to be regarded as a light syllable for English, we need to consider that this sequence of two consonants, pa and la, belongs in the onset of the final syllable. Otherwise, the result would have been a heavy final syllable. Similarly, let's consider the word recalcitrant, where here we have four syllables. Recalcitrant, something like the phonetic transcription will need to look something like this, more or less. Here, the primary stress again falls on the third to last syllable. The second to last syllable is again light if we assume that this sequence tra becomes an onset in the last syllable. So in all of these words, we can have primary stress falling on the second to last syllable, assuming that there are going to be complex onsets built in certain cases. And this behavior in English and the fact that we find these complex onsets being built make for a very good argument for syllables, because the fact that we need these complex onsets and we need those complex onsets and the ability to refer to a difference between light and heavy syllables makes it impossible for us to rewrite the Latin stress rule, which is relevant here, in terms of just consonants and vowels, because in some cases, English won't allow certain combinations of consonants to make a complex onset. So we would need to specifically perhaps refer to particular phonological features of particular segments to say when you have certain sequences of certain particular segments that stress will be on the third to last syllable, but when there are other certain particular sequences of segments, it would fall on the second to last syllable. So the stress rule would become enormously complex, even more complex than the way it looks using consonants and vowels for the for the classical Arabic system. So for that reason, we should really very much prefer, from the point of view of analytical simplicity, to be able to just refer to a light syllable in the second to last syllable. And to refer to diachrony a little bit more explicitly, let's look at the developments now between Latin and French. Now, it's well known, of course, that French has descended diachronically from Latin, but as we just saw, the stress patterns between Old French and Latin were quite different. The question is, how did this happen? Did the speakers of French somehow come up with, simply invent a new stress rule and then begin applying it? Or was there a sort of restructuring and reanalysis? So let's consider in this data, in a few, or in some of this data below, where the stress fell on certain words of Latin and certain words of French. So in, for instance, the word for flour, farina in Latin, the stress would have fallen on the second to last syllable because it contains a long vowel, and in French, it falls in the final syllable, farine. And interestingly, that seems to be the same syllable in the word meaning frail or breakable. In Latin, it would have been fragile, with primary stress on the first syllable. And in French, it seems to be on the same corresponding syllable. It's a bit, there has been a lot of loss of segments, but this e vowel corresponds to the a in Latin. So we have frere in French. What appears to have happened systematically in Latin and French is that there was apocope, or rather syncope, of syllables following the primary stress. So in the word farina, the last syllable was lost. And in the word fragile, the two syllables following the primary stress were lost. Because of the loss of those post-tonic syllables, the result was then that stress always appeared to be on the final syllable. Let's see if we can find another simulare, asinus. Yes, the word for donkey and the word for soul show us two other examples in which both post-tonic syllables were syncopated. So in Latin, these would have been stressed as anima and asinus, but we have simply and am in French, with both of the two following syllables having been syncopated. So what we can see is that in the history of stress assignment between Latin and French, the data changed because of a rule which said that we can simply imagine this as a rule which says that a vowel was deleted when it was preceded by a syllable that was stressed. And the result is then that if all the unstressed vowels following the primary stress were deleted, then the primary stress will always simply be in the last syllable of the word. And that means that there would be a natural reanalysis of the data. All right, let's now briefly summarize what we've seen today. So we've looked today at some examples of phonologically predictable stress patterns, and we were able to practice determining a language's stress system by looking at some data giving stress transcriptions. We did this for Maranuku and waral. And we also learned how to formulate stress rules to describe those patterns using the features plus or minus stress and plus or minus main to distinguish between primary or main stress and secondary stress. And we've seen in the cases of classical Arabic and the Latinate words of English that stress can also be sensitive to a distinction between heavy and light syllables, where heavy syllables contain either a long vowel or a coda consonant, and light syllables have simply a short vowel and no coda consonants. And in order to write stress rules that describe all of these patterns, we needed to introduce iterative rules, rules that can apply multiple times until all of their targets are left over, or eliminated rather, and parentheses in order to describe different possible options for the assignment of stress. And one nice thing in phonological analysis as a whole is that there is an interaction between syllable structure and stress, whereas what we saw in the Latinate vocabulary of English here is that the assignment of the primary stress gives us an indication of how the syllables are being constructed. Because in order for words like discipline to receive primary stress on the third to last syllable, that means that the second to last syllable needs to be short, and therefore the final syllable must have a consonant cluster in its onset, rather than these two consonants being divided between syllables, making the second to last syllable heavy. All right, so this closes our discussion of stress for this week. In the exercise session, we will work out a few more stress rules, and next week we will come to the discussion of tone and intonation. Thanks, everyone.